All right, we have John, and correct me if I'm wrong, but your last name is pronounced Rapley?
That's right.
That's right. Okay. With us here is John Rapley. We're discussing the book Why Empires Fail. Fall, sorry. I always say fail, but it's always fall. Uh, so John, I guess my first question is usually after reading something and interviewing someone, I'm curious as what prompted you to write this book? It was quite interesting and it had a lot of historical facts. So I guess what prompted that?
Um, it was really actually quite accidental, Alex, a bit of serendipity. What happened is, go back a long way. I was a postdoc at Oxford back in the 90s, and while there, socially encountered Peter Heather, who was a historian. We didn't work together in any way. We were vaguely aware of one another's different areas of work. He was at that time a junior fellow at in history, and I was doing development studies at Queen Elizabeth House, and um, and then we went our separate ways. I took a job. I've been living and working in developing countries, but I also did a lecturing gig every spring in the south of France. And one we had a mutual friend who had a place, who's an artist, had a place in the south of France, and I was there over one Easter. He said, "Why don't you come spend Easter with us?" And as it happens, our neighbors, the Heathers, who that's in fact how I met Peter, was through my friend, the artist, who was also my drinking mate in Oxford. Um, we spent a weekend together. I had just finished writing a book on globalization, and he was just about to publish what would be his bestseller on the fall of the Roman Empire. So we just got to talking one afternoon, and what are we doing? What have you been doing since I last saw you? However, 12 years ago, whatever. And we sort of said, well, we written these books, we compared the narratives. And what struck us at the time is that even though completely independent of each other, writing about completely different time periods, we were coming up to very similar conclusions. Essentially, that in the ascendant phase of an empire, that history is determined at the center, but as you go further and further into the history of the empire, the periphery ends up driving a lot of the change and ultimately is the driver at the end of the empire. And even though, as I say, I was talking about globalization and its impact on developing countries, and he was talking about the Roman Empire, we said maybe there's something about to do with the life cycle of empires. And we just decided to apply ourselves to this exercise. It was a long process, went through several different drafts before we finally found just the right one that worked, and then was ultimately published last year.
Interesting. Yeah. I guess I was going to say is, did it have anything to do with this new modern day fad where like, youngish men are just constantly talking about the Roman Empire and how they spend all their time? But, but I guess
No, no,
not.
that was I have to say that for us that was extraordinarily fortuitous. I published an article in the New York Times in to coincide with the North American launch of the book, which was in early September. And I think the next day, the Washington Post ran this piece on why are men always talking about or thinking about the Roman Empire. I don't know if that was their sort of response to the New York Times publishing this piece, which got quite a lot of reading, or they already had an article ready to go. It was kind of surprising. Although my answer to that is, I'm always surprised that people are surprised we spend so much time talking about the Roman Empire because it's not, in fact, just men. I mean, the Roman Empire casts such a long shadow over the history of the entire Western world, everything from our legal traditions, our educational system, our languages. It's all a legacy of that time. So you can't really escape it. Although it wasn't, in fact, that we weren't saying, oh, this has just been the continuation of one long imperial history. We said they were very different, and we suspect that our model of imperial rise and fall explains any empire. And we did, in some of the stuff we published since, challenge our colleagues and historians of other parts of the world to sort of actually consider the model. I don't know if anyone's done it yet, but it seems to be getting talked about at any rate.
So John, in the first part of the book, you used Roman history to understand the rise of the West. I think a lot of us don't even really understand how vast the Roman Empire was. Can you break down how big it actually was and some of the zones it was composed of?
Well, if you look at a map, Jack, of course, you can see it stretches all the way from, contemporary Iraq to up into the border between England and Scotland. Covers a huge expanse. But Peter was the one who made the argument that to really understand the vastness of the empire, you have to take into account the communications technology of the day. The principal communication technology, if it was a seaborne, it was basically a horse and cart. And the time it took to travel from one end of the empire to the other, if you then sort of brought it to the present day and use existing seaborne, technology or aircraft, I mean, you'd have an empire that went around the world and kept going around the world. It would be absolutely vast in its extent. It was not the biggest empire in history. The Mongol Empire ended up being much bigger, but it was it was very long lived, and it had a striking degree of continuity. And then, of course, its legacy. I mean, the Mongol Empire certainly had a legacy, but and all empires do. But then you get some, for example, like the empire of the Hunnic Empire of Attila, which is an empire, or famously the Holy Roman Empire. They say it's neither Holy Roman nor an empire. Empire is a name only. They were very short-lived, no administrative continuity, and when they disappear, in the case of the Empire of Attila, they practically don't leave a trace to history. Whereas the great empires of history, like the Roman Empire, like the Mughal Empire in India, like the Ottoman Empire, leave marks that last for centuries.
Yeah, you definitely brought up you brought up a lot of empires and just people I had never heard of at all, which was sort of interesting to read about. So when you say, I guess just for context, like how big was I always just assumed I mean this is somewhat tangential, but the Mongol Empire you just said was larger than the Roman Empire. Did I hear that correctly?
The Mongol Empire was at its full extent. It stretched across much of Asia into Europe up to Kiev and Rus. Of course, the Roman Empire is ultimately a legacy of that period. So it was absolutely vast, yes. And of course, the Chinese Empire it's an empire in a very different way from the Roman Empire, because it doesn't, it expands up to its sort of natural frontiers and no further, and then has no interest in expanding further. The Chinese really very early decided to abandon, their navy and became rather insular, as is well known. Unlike the Romans had this sort of imperialist mission to keep going out and further out, partly because that's how you paid your lead. The soldiers, you would sort of, they would give service, and then in return, they would get a piece of land on the frontier after they'd helped conquer it.
Okay, so with the Chinese Empire, when you were saying they were becoming insolent, that was from a historical perspective, or would you say that correct?
Yes. In the Middle
Okay.
Ages, they just simply didn't see the need to sort of. There was overseas exploration, and then they just abandoned it. And they didn't have any particular need. They didn't have the kind of economic need that the resources that later on, when we look at the modern Western Empire, it starts in Europe. It was a question of getting access to the markets of the East that really drove, and the fact that the only passage to China went through what was essentially a monopoly controlled by Venice. That's what really incentivized the move into deep sea navigation and finding ways to go around, by sea rather than over land to get to the east.
Okay. So briefly in the book, you talked about the eastern and western fronts of Rome. I guess usually when I would think of Rome, I would just think of Rome centered, I guess, on Rome. But you sort of make it sound like I guess, I don't know, when I was reading this, I envisioned it as like, I guess like minor hubs on those fronts. Is that accurate? Is that correct?
No, you'd have these would be major capitals. The thing about Rome itself, the city of Rome, remains the spiritual center of the Roman Empire. And again, as it remains after the fall of the empire, remains the spiritual center of Christendom, a book that Peter actually published recently with that very title. And but administratively, it isn't, and that has to do with the communications technology again. That getting sort of messages to the frontier provinces, the time it would take, it was simply impossible to run it centrally at that point. By the time it becomes the empire at its full extent, which is why this term that is used in the book, the inside-out empire, came to apply. Essentially, the argument being that we think of it, we think of an empire as being a centralized entity. And that's largely because our perception has been shaped by the modern European empires, where communications technology, not just ships, but also telegraphs, make it possible for London or Paris or Brussels to actually communicate, in very quickly with the provinces. That wasn't the case in the Roman Empire. So it was left to the provincial nobility to administer the empire. And what held it together was this cultural glue. Peter talks about what he uses the term Latin towns and togas, and of course Roman law and education. It's a very important part of it. So this would be a nobility literate not only in Roman law but in Latin, obviously. So they would not have come from Rome. They would have come, by and large, in the latter stages of the empire. They're all coming out of the provinces, but they become Romanized. They sort of culturally assimilate. So this is what we say, the similarities with the modern day. In an earlier version of the book, we went at some length looking at the role universities played. We took it out in we decided to go with a short book, but the way in which, for example, at Harvard and Yale, right up until the 20th century, you still had to be able to speak Latin and Greek to gain admission to the university. In my parents' time in Oxford, you still had to. Latin was still an entrance requirement. This kind of idea that there was a standardized education model and everybody was being socialized into the same sort of core tenets, that kind of ability to, and we point out in the post-war period, that ability to take a number of countries which have been enemies for so long and bind them together under US hegemony by this shared culture, the so-called rules-based order, which has been much maligned of late, but that was quite cohesive, certainly for a long time after American domination, but it's not being run from Washington. Washington, if you will, is the primus inter pares. It is it shapes the narrative and the contours of imperial administration, but the countries remain sovereign, and they act on their own, but they're bound together by a common set of principles. And of course, trade is vital.
Can you talk a little bit about how the introduction of vaccines and how that influenced people actually coming to America and perhaps strengthening the West?
The introduction of vaccines.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, inoculation, and then of course, with a number of things that take place in the 19th century in Europe. But the main point is that you get, as a result of vaccination, as a result of also improved nutrition, there's a really quite, if you look at the graphs on daily caloric intake in most European countries over the 19th century, with various lags. I mean, Britain is a bit earlier than the rest, but prior to the 19th century, most of these countries, most people are eating, barely a survival diet. People were not big, they were not strong, they were not particularly healthy, they had short lives. The improvement of nutrition, and then with inoculation, which of course dramatically lowers the death rate, and also improved techniques of medical care as well, although those really begin to come in the 20th century. So what happens from about the middle of the 19th century is because you get much lower infant mortality and people living a bit longer thanks to improved nutrition, suddenly you get a surge in the European population. And people who have for centuries, had large families, partly because it's in order to ensure you have enough hands working on the farm when you're unable to work. I mean, there's no concept of retirement as we know it, but there comes a time when you need someone to look after you. And so to ensure you have enough children to do that, you have very large families. People continue having large families for about 3 generations, in spite of the fact that their children are surviving in much larger numbers. So there's a big increase in the European population. The other thing which happens is at the same time you're getting the adoption of modern farming techniques. So instead of very labor intensive, like for example, you take in southern Italy, very labor intensive farming process where you get the consolidation, you get the emergence of these big farms which are using employed workforces, starting to introduce machinery so they don't need as many laborers. And so you get a large landless population. It's huge. And Europe, which historically has about 15% of the world's population, in the space of a few generations on the eve of the First World War, has about 1 in 4 of the planet's population. It's just an awful lot of Europeans. There's not enough land to feed them. And so this is, of course, the high period of European imperialism. So they're all, they have all these opportunities to head, not necessarily to, parts of the empire, usually to parts of the empire, but the big, one of the big draws was the Americas, both the United States and in South America, an awful lot of European migrants going there. So there's a huge wave of migration, and it goes throughout the whole world. And we see the legacy of that to this day. I mean, you see white people in Africa that you wouldn't have seen, 2 centuries ago, living in places like South Africa, living in places like Zimbabwe, living all over Africa. You get Indians, you get people that came as a result of the movement of populations within the empire. So you get a much more mixed population than you would have had before the empire.
Yeah, I mean, you have this chart with I guess sort of going back to the child mortality thing. You have this chart on I guess page 31 of the book where the child mortality rate in like 1880 was 30% or roughly there in most of Europe, and then like 50% in Germany. I mean, that's pretty shocking. Like a 50% child mortality rate is massive. Is that the historical norm, I guess?
Um, there was a couple of things that happened that really, first of all, you get a surge in mortality that happens after the Napoleonic Wars. The economy goes into a long depression. And so output drops quite sharply. And then, of course, mid-century, you get a wave of famines. Famously in the the sort of the popular imagination of English-speaking countries, we speak of the Irish potato famine. That would be where it was one of the countries that was hardest hit by famine. But that particular crop failure spread right across Europe. So there's a period in the early part of the 19th century where mortality is especially high. And then from about mid-century, this combination of factors begins to bring it down rather sharply. So that would have not been the historical norm. But you did certainly have, of course, throughout history, what you did have across the world is you had periods of very, very high mortality interspersed with periods of more regular mortality. So if you just contrast, the COVID-19 pandemic, which is, the biggest plague in history, if you will, in terms of the extent, it covers virtually the entire planet. But you compare it to the Black Death of the Middle Ages in Europe, where 1 in 3, they estimate, 1 in 3 Europeans died in the space of about 5 years. I mean, that's an astonishing level of mortality we simply don't see anymore. And so that's one of the achievements of this modern period, is that suddenly you get these waves of, and they start just going in one direction, at least until recently, which is just going down, 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 which means life expectancy goes up, up, up. And, until you get the fertility transition, which starts in about the 1920s into about mid-century, where Europeans and North Americans begin gradually adjusting their family size downward to the point we've reached today, where they're not even at replacement level. The population, the native-born population, is actually getting smaller, and it's only immigration that keeps these economies going.
Another huge influencer you guys bring up in chapter 4 is money. Can you describe what money was being used throughout the Roman Empire and then parallel that with our new system under the Bretton Woods Agreement?
Yes, I mean, you really need to have Peter in on this conversation to answer the question as to how coinage was done. They were using what's called a specie system, where they actually have printed coins, and we don't, of course. We use a fiat, what's called a fiat system. So, one of the misconceptions about money, this is another book I wrote about on this very topic about money, is we think of money as a physical thing. We think of it as dollar bills or coins in our pockets or whatever. We think of that as money, but that in fact is actually only about not even 3% of the supply of money in circulation. Most of the money takes no physical form. I mean, people have this sort of, we all have this kind of impression in our head that when you go to the bank, there's a drawer with cash in it, and they're moving cash from one drawer to another when you withdraw. In fact, this is the real innovation of the modern period. It's what called fractional reserve banking, where most of the money is not actually today, unlike what was the case in the Roman Empire, is not actually printed by the government. The government regulates the process, but it's controlled by private banks. And the way it works, for example, if you go, people sort of think, well, when they borrow money from the bank, whether it's on a credit card or a student loan, or if they take out a mortgage, that there's a pool of money the bank is taking, that's its depositors' money, and they transfer it and say, okay, well, you're going to have to pay us back so we can pay our depositors. But that's not in fact how it works. The bank will sort of assess your credit worthiness. If they reckon you're going to find a way to pay this back, they essentially create the money out of thin air. They simply put a credit in your account, which they're authorized to do, and they have to put a deposit. In the US, it would be on the Federal Reserve, which will be about 5 to 10% of the value of the loan. And the purpose of those reserves, by the way, is just they're lodged at the Federal Reserve. If there's ever a bank run, which happens periodically, the Federal Reserve has that pool of cash it can make available to banks, so that they can reassure their clients, don't worry, we're not going to go out of business, just to keep the system functioning. But the vast amount of debt isn't backed up by anything. It's backed up again by effectively our future labor. So the role that money plays in the modern period is money in the Roman Empire and in for most of human history is merely a medium of exchange, or it can be a store of wealth, but you have to physically store it somewhere. You have to find a vault somewhere, and you have to guard it. And it's a physical thing you're guarding. Whereas today, the vast majority of the money, when you look at a bank statement, when you open your, computer browser or your mobile phone and you look at those figures, those are digits in cyberspace. They have no physical reality. But what it is, it enables you to use those digits to sort of pay for things, whether it's a house or whether it's going to shop at Walgreens or whatever it is you're buying. And so the creation of this modern money system enables much faster economic growth, because effectively what you can now do is you can redistribute money from the future to the present. You can spend today what you're going to make tomorrow. And because of that, we can accelerate the rate of growth. And that is, a vital part of what creates the modern, the rise of the modern world as we know it.
So I guess talking about that, so I don't know if I understood this correctly, but in Roman times, you were saying the main source of wealth was land. Is that correct?
Yeah, almost entirely would have been land.
So, okay, so one of the common things that I had previously heard was part of the fall or collapse of the Roman Empire had to do with them, I guess, cutting it's denarii. Was that the Roman coin? Is that correct?
Oh, yes. I mean, that there is a theory about that. Now, again, I'd really need Peter to answer that question, but my understanding is that the debasement was not, that there are all sorts of theories about the fall of the Roman Empire. The use of lead pipes for water drove everybody mad, that sort of thing. But I don't believe those are considered
Well, I guess you just want to go through, I guess, the main points of like what I guess you guys postulate caused the Roman Empire to fall.
Well, to put it simply, the barbarians. But whereas there is, and to this day, a very powerful narrative, very popular, particularly in conservative circles in Western countries, that internal decay is what brings the empire down. And not just, I shouldn't say just among political conservatives, talk about this. They say that immigration is sort of, we're losing our cultural center. We're becoming, multicultural, and therefore we're not attached to the, in the same way they liken that this is based on Edward Gibbon's history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and the argument that when the empire became Christianized, it lost its adherence to the core values that held the empire together. It became mongrelized, it gradually debased, and it lost the will to resist, effectively, is what he's saying. And then actually, interestingly, where this has been picked up, this particular model has been picked up by economists. Economists like to say, well, yes, it was because when it abandoned the republic and became an empire, that's when the decline began, that democracy is always better for economic growth and empire, and the institutions were all wrong. This is, in their book, Why Nations Fail, Ashimoglu and Robinson made this argument. But in fact, it's none of that. What really happens, the empire keeps expanding, it keeps getting richer and richer, right up almost to the point of its collapse. But in the process of, what makes it rich is the exploitation of its colonial periphery. But in the process of exploiting the colonial periphery, it's inadvertently leading to the development of that periphery, so that over time, these peripheral states begin to acquire the resources, first of all, the economic and material resources, to be able to put up more effective resistance. And then they start, of course, particularly the military technology, they start, learning how to use Roman weapons, and they begin to organize more effective armies, and they begin to create more effective states rather than being essentially sort of small, gatherings of tribal confederations. They're now actually creating proper state structures with kings and an aristocracy, and are able to organize large military incursions. So that the very thing which makes the empire rich and powerful is the very thing which ultimately comes back to undermine it. And we say in the modern period, what you have is you get a similar trajectory, which is that, the period of the 19th century through the 20th century is a period when there's a net transfer of resources from the global periphery to the heart of the empire. And of course, we say that after the World War II is the peak of the Western Empire, that you get a confederal empire similar to the late Roman Empire emerging under American leadership. And this is the period of the greatest economic development takes place in the West, but in the process, again, inadvertently leading to the development of the periphery until they can begin to fight back. They don't fight back militarily, they fight back diplomatically. They begin to get better trade deals, they begin to get better investment deals, they begin to win at the bargaining table, as it were. And that's where the power shift takes place and continues to take place.
Who do you see as someone or a country that is in the periphery? Or is it not a country? Is it a type of person?
Well, essentially, and I wouldn't say it would have to be former colonies, because, for example, China would have been former periphery. It's now becoming far more significant, and it wasn't a colony. It was essentially dominated by European powers in the 19th century and well into the 20th century. But India is former periphery, and of course, originally the United States, what becomes the United States, is periphery. That's an example, an early example of a peripheral power that develops to the point it can resist and completely overthrow within its own territory imperial rule. Although, of course, it doesn't then, it then quickly establishes a peace and has a harmonious relationship with Europe and with Britain in particular thereafter, and they prosper together. But all the former colonies and that would include, so if you take Latin America, for example, which were former Spanish and Portuguese colonies, but by the 19th century, they're really dominated increasingly by British and then later by American capital, largely finance capital. A lot of the money that's going into, building the railways is coming from Europe. And so that brings them into those networks of finance, which ultimately operate to the benefit of Europe, of North America. So some of these countries have lifted themselves completely out of the periphery, like South Korea. Some of them are well on their way. I mean, they're out of the periphery. They're not necessarily fully developed countries like China. And some are in a much earlier stage, but on a path of clear assertion of, being one day a great power, a country like India. Brazil is, that would be another country that still, we would say, well, today it's in the periphery, but it's becoming also increasingly assertive. So strictly speaking, you could say that these are all countries which are still in the global periphery, but it's changing very rapidly.
And then dialing in on, you had a statement in the book that I think it basically said today's immigrants are the modern day barbarians. Can we dial in a little bit on that? Because are barbarians not necessarily the same as like on the periphery?
Well, okay, we make that statement precisely to refute it, to say that, the parallel, because that's a very popular parallel among right-wing politicians, especially the far right, that the kind of narrative of someone like Donald Trump, about Mexican rapists, they come across the border, they take our jobs, they take our women. So they play upon these ancient tropes, this fear of the foreign invasion, of the barbarian hordes. In Europe, you get a lot of that. Islam is the sort of all these Muslim immigrants are coming and destroying Christian cultures and imposing Sharia law. Most of it is just invented. But we point out the parallels simply don't apply. That I remember former Prime Minister of Britain, Boris Johnson, once saying that what brought the Roman Empire down was uncontrolled migration, and we have to control the borders. But in fact, it wasn't uncontrolled migration which brought down the Roman Empire. It was highly controlled migration. Those states were well organized. They were organizing large armies. There's nothing comparable. Immigrants coming across the border in the backs of trucks, or in small boats, or trying to be smuggled in the holds of aircraft, are not coming in large organized waves at all. And they're coming primarily, they're not being driven in, they're being drawn in by the fact that their labor is required. I mean, as much as governments in Western countries might like to complain about immigrants coming in, they're coming in because they're importing them. Because if they didn't, the economies of most Western countries would collapse, because there simply isn't enough a growth in the labor supply to support a growing dependent population, which is to say, you get a very large now retired population. Well, who's going to actually, do the work to not only to look after these people, but more importantly, to keep the economy going, so you can generate the resources to feed and clothe and house these people and keep them the standard to which they're accustomed. If you're not producing workers, if family size has gone down, or you don't even get families coming, you need to bring a labor supply from elsewhere. And so it's an organized migration by the recipient countries. They very much control the borders, and politicians like to blame this kind of chaotic surge. But in fact, most of the increase in migration to Western countries is actually being controlled by Western governments. The share that is illegal migration is only about 5%.
Okay, and then did I understand this correctly? So the barbarians that came into Rome, there were like two groups, like essentially two, like almost in the book, the way I interpreted this was like two, like almost like peoples that were militarized, that one group was allowed into Rome and the other group was not. Was that correct?
Well, there were several at this point. There were several states on the border, and that Peter talks about that passage where there was an attempt to bring them in, and then they grew restive. And of course, a lot of the pressure then is building even further from the frontier. I mentioned the Hunnic Empire, so the rise of Attila is a lot of these states, which you had this sort of kind of stability on the frontier between the Roman Empire and these new frontier states. But it gets disrupted by the arrival of the Huns, because they start then pushing, excuse me, up against these frontier states. So they're forced to come into the empire in some cases. If they're not allowed in by the Romans, they just fight their way in, and that's what is driving this process.
Okay, and then I don't think I really understood this. What triggered, I guess, the conflict from the migrants coming into the empire and I guess the historic Romans?
Well, what triggered it is obviously the fact that, um, I mean, for as long as there was a stability on the frontier, they sort of lived relatively harmoniously. So these would be states that were very often in tributary relationships to Rome, and so they would pay some kind of tax to Rome in return for being able, left unmolested. But occasionally they seek to change the terms of the bargain, and so they will launch some kind of invasion to try and take Roman land. And for most of Roman history, these are then pushed back, and the Romans reimpose their hegemony. What happens is eventually you get so many of these conflicts multiplying at the frontier because these states are becoming more developed, and the Romans increasingly are, spending more and more of their resources to try and withstand them. And it reaches a tipping point where they simply can't withstand them all at once. And every time they try and make peace by letting one state come in, okay, you can come and settle in this area and we'll allow you to have a portion of the land, but that then depletes the imperial revenue, the imperial treasury, which they need to sustain the army to keep fighting. So it becomes a sort of erosion and then it unravels fairly quickly in the 5th century.
I guess this is somewhat going back to a previous statement you made, but do you think it's important for, I guess, immigrants to assimilate to the culture of the country they're coming into?
Well, I do think it is important. I think what I would say is I think we sometimes underestimate the degree to which they do. I've lived much of my life in what is, we call the global periphery. And one of the striking things, if you live in a country um, that sends immigrants to developed countries, and when they come back, is how culturally assimilated they've usually become into the country they go to. They speak the language, they've developed preference for new foods, they come back with more liberal views about the role of women. And they're often, that causes tension when they come back home. Um, and this is one of the arguments we make towards the end of the book, that rather than seeing immigrants in Western countries as being hostile for us, they're potential allies in building up support in the countries they've come from. Many of them have left their countries and just reject them altogether, reject them culturally completely. Others don't. They're trying to navigate a common ground. The ones who outright reject the host country's culture completely, I would guess, is a minority of most groups. We look at them and we say, well, they have different food, they have different language, they have all this, and all of which is true. But on the other hand, most of them, particularly if they're young, speak the local language, they have, local friends, and they have actually fit in. And when you speak with the older generation, the ones who really didn't want to lose the culture and who want to keep away, alive the practices of the old country, they sometimes get a bit dismayed. Now, certain immigrant groups have been more resistant to assimilation than others. That's true, and that is a particular problem. But even then, you will often find that members of that group are among those who are trying to lead a process of enabling these people to feel at home. And part of the thing that makes their job very difficult is in many, particularly many European countries, there's a complete resistance to foreigners. They're just foreigners, period. They'll never be locals. And you get, quite frankly, very high degrees of racism, which make it much harder for them to assimilate than you get in more traditionally immigrant societies like the US or Canada or Australia.
So I guess projecting forward, what are some of the things? I mean, in the end of the book, you kind of talk about some of I think you call it like the fiscal contract, like in the Roman Empire. A lot of this just involved protecting the land and enforcing the laws and contracts. And you mentioned we have a lot more welfare programs, and that a lot of especially like the taxes on income versus your net worth or property, it's only affecting the people that are actually earning income. and this deterioration of this like fiscal contract. So can you describe some of the things going forward that will help ensure that we don't lose that fiscal contract?
The big challenge, Jack, we sort of land on near the end of the book is this unanticipated. I mean, it's an achievement, but it's created a huge challenge, and that is the very large share of the population which is retired. You know, when pensions, I mean, the very first pension system in the modern period was created in 19th century Germany, at a time that life expectancy was less than 65. So retirement age of 65, you were a very rare person that made it to that point. And what the public pension created in Germany was designed to do is to prevent somebody who happened to live long of not having to work until they're very, you know, when they're well past the ability to work. Because in the late 19th century, 65 in Germany was a very old age, and you weren't in great health. And if you were still working, you know, you're trying to prevent indigence. The big expansion of pensions takes place in the post-World War II period. In 1945, in most Western countries, average life expectancy is about 67. So you create a system in which the expectation is, on average, people are going to live for 2 years past retirement. And again, what you're really trying to do is you're enabling, saying, look, you've worked a long life. Now you can spend your last few years. You don't have to work to your grave. You know, you can, and then of course we instituted healthcare in every public healthcare everywhere, but the U.S. in a significant way. So we look after people. What we didn't anticipate is that we'd reach a point where people were living well into their 80s and 90s, and in some cases, many cases, drawing a pension for longer than they paid into the pension. In other words, the money they actually paid into their pension fund is nowhere near enough to support them in the kind of retirement they're getting now, simply because life expectancy through the post-war period continued improving dramatically. It only peaked really towards the end of the 20th century, and it's kind of plateaued and it's rising much more slowly. And in some cases in the US, it's actually declining. But nevertheless, you know, people are, you know, spending 20, 30, and not just, you know, they're not just necessarily living at home and watching the television. And, you know, a lot of these pensioners are leading very comfortable lives. They're traveling abroad. And how do you support that? The way you have to do it is you have to kind of go into the fiscal contract and change the terms of the agreement. Not necessarily, I mean, one obvious way is to just raise taxes on the working population to support the elderly, but there are other ways you can tax the working population. One, for example, which has become quite widespread in Western countries, is that invested heavily in real estate. And then, which means that the cost of renting or buying accommodation goes up and up and up. So you're squeezing more money from the population to go to support these people. And that's a breakdown. That, you know, that was not the agreement. The agreement was in the post-war period, well, you know, you could have on one income, you could buy a nice house. I mean, I'm sure you've seen this meme on the internet, you know, in 1990 when The Simpsons, you know, first started, a family, you know, a guy with a high school education could sort of house his family in a house like this. And it, you know, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but there was some truth to it. It's simply unimaginable today. So we've kind of broken the fiscal contract, and that's going to cause, and it is causing, serious social and political tensions in Western countries. And I think we need to go into it and look seriously, because the alternative will simply be to import far more immigrants. And some Western countries are trying to do that, but then they're running into various, you know, political ructions of their own, you know, because these immigrants themselves need to be housed. They need to, you know, and they don't necessarily, you know, in such large numbers, it's less easy to assimilate them. So Western countries have been sort of postponing dealing with this, but they're going to have to face up to it sooner or later.
I guess if you were in charge, I guess the impression I got was, yeah, sort of what you were just saying. The goal is to get a higher amount of tax revenue. So if you were in charge, what are some of the things that you would do to, I guess, garnish that to be able to support, I guess, the retirees?
Well, the first thing I'd look at, I mean, some of these things are being looked at by Western countries. One is looking at the retirement age. I mean, and I think the thing is we have a standardized retirement age, and I'm not sure that's appropriate. If you work as a builder or as a mover, to say, well, everyone should work till they're 70 now, that this is somebody who's simply physically not capable. But on the other hand, if you're a university lecturer or a teacher, there's all sorts of professions where it would be quite reasonable to say, well, the physical demands you're placing on your body are such that you don't need to retire at 65. And moreover, you have a set of skills that are very useful to us. You have mentorship and leadership abilities. And so people should be, required. In other words, we treat pensions as purely contributory. It's what you pay in is what you take out. I don't know, we might want to revisit that model. And, kind of go to from each according to his, her ability, to each according to his or need. I think we have to look at, is it possible to sustain the lifestyles that we do? You work as a firefighter, and then when you're retired, your living standard actually improves. You're traveling abroad 2 or 3 times a year. It's great, but someone has to pay for that, and as I say, you haven't actually paid for it in the contributions you make, despite what you think. Again, we think of a pension pot being, that's your cash, it's yours, you put aside, but in fact, that's not how it works. The money you put in effectively is being spent when you put it in, and the understanding that they'll find someone to generate revenue for you when it's your turn. But what you had to pay to support someone when you were a young working person in the 1950s, for someone of that age group, is much less than what the person being, working today has to put in. So I think we have to look at how much we distribute. I think we have to look at retirement ages. I think we need to revisit the tax system. We have to honestly say, look, what are the services we want to keep? These things cost money. And, for a long period of our imperial history, we effectively had a subsidy coming from the global periphery that's gone. We're now going to look within ourselves to find the resources for that. So who should pay? A shift away from income to wealth tax is something I favor as an economist, just because I think it leads to greater economic efficiency. So you don't tax people primarily based on their income. You tax them on how much wealth they've accumulated. I think there are various things like that. But I mean, these are not mutually exclusive, and nor is it an exhaustive list. But I do think we need to have an honest conversation, and politicians simply don't want to do that. Nobody wants to be the one to sort of go before the public and say, to have good roads and airports and good healthcare and good schools, costs money. How are we going to pay for this? They keep saying, well, we're going to cut taxes and, eliminate waste and these kinds of sort of suggestions, which really are just a way to kick the can down the road and not deal with it.
Okay, real one quick follow-up question. You talked about, you gave the example right there of the firefighter, but you talked about their standard of life increasing after they retired from the pension. Can you explain that? I don't. So I mean, that to me implies that they're pulling out, like, their monthly income would increase after retirement. Is that what you were saying?
I wouldn't necessarily say put it that way, Alex. I would say their monthly disposable income would increase. Now, the reason for that, and it doesn't apply to all pensioners, it applies to certain types of pensioners. But for example, if you have paid off your mortgage, so you don't have any mortgage costs or rental costs, therefore, by the time you're retired and you draw your pension income, and of course, you just have more time, to actually use it. You can spend more time traveling, or perhaps you bought yourself a winter condo or a cottage or something like that. This would probably only apply to the top, 15 to 20% of pensioners. I mentioned firefighters simply because that's the case. I happen to know that, years ago there was a controversy in London, in England, where I was living, where a local housing estate, which had been built as sort of low rent housing, had been bought by a private equity fund who was going to evict all the families, refurbish them, jack up the rents, and then rent them out. And it was clear that none of the people living there were ever going to be able to come back. They were going to be made homeless. And this caused, a minor political uproar in Britain. And it emerged in the course of this that I think it was the New York firefighters pension fund that was the owner behind the private equity firm that had bought it out. It may have been another, it was a New York public. It may have been teachers, it may have been police. I can't remember, but it was one of them. But that's just an example of the way in which sort of people living today are often getting squeezed to support people in that, standard of living. So, and certainly, I was born and raised in Canada, and there's a housing crisis in Canada. And one of the drivers of the housing crisis is pension funds doing just this, squeezing more and more income from renters, from tenants, contributing to a homelessness problem in order to support, retired teachers and civil servants, who, if they've given a career in those particular professions, for example, in Canada, they live quite comfortably in retirement unless they've been wasteful with their money, as I say, especially if they've paid off their mortgage. These are very often the sort of stories you hear about people, that children are living with them still because their children can't afford homes, but they can afford to put them up, or in some cases, they're the ones who pay for their first home deposit. The money, whereas historically it would have been the children looking after the parents. Now we've got this in the last generation, this flipped on its head, where it's the children looking after parents.
Jack, do you have any more questions?
I don't think so. It's been fun, John. Why don't you tell people where they can go learn more about you, and where they can go buy the books?
Well, the book is available, all the websites, obviously Amazon. I would think it's in most bookstores. It's quite freely available. And there's also, I don't know if it's available in North America. There is an audio edition of the British publication. And as for me, I'm easy to find online. If you Google me, I write for a number of newspapers, and I'm regularly in the public domain. So, I'm only too happy for people to follow up.
Okay, well, I think with that said, please reach out to us at brothersonbooks@gmail.com if you have any book recommendations, or if you'd like to be a guest host for a particular book you have in mind. A great review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to would be greatly appreciated. And lastly, if you can think of any friend, family member, or coworker that might like this episode, please pass it along. Yet again, it was Why Empires Fall. John, it was great having you on. Thank you for coming on and talking with us. Jack, as always, it's been a pleasure.
Pleasure.
Been a pleasure, guys. Have a good day.
You too.